Welcome to Green Building Matters, the podcast that matters for green building professionals. Learn insight in green buildings as we interview today's experts in LEED and WELL. We'll learn from their career paths, war stories, and all things green, because green building matters. And now our host, and yes, he has every LEED and WELL credential. Here's Charlie Cicchetti.
Be sure to check out the Green Building Matters community, where you can have unlimited exam prep for any of the professional credential exams you're tackling next, as well as putting your continuing education on autopilot, saving time with GBS reporting your hours on your behalf. Check it out, gbes.com/join. Now, enjoy this episode of the Green Building Matters podcast.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the next episode of the Green Building Matters podcast, where I get to interview green building professionals from all over the world. And today with us from Calgary, Alberta, Canada, is Joanne Perdue. She's the Associate Vice President of Sustainability at the University of Calgary. I can't wait to learn more about Joanne. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Charlie. It's a really beautiful late summer day here in Calgary. The sun is shining. And of course, we're welcoming our students back to campus. We have remote learning, but nonetheless, it's a really exciting time of the year for us.
I bet that fall semester, and can't wait to learn a little more about the curriculum you've been working on for so many years. But I always like to say, take us back. Where'd you grow up and where'd you go to school?
Yeah, that's a great opening question, Charlie. I grew up in a small town in the heart of the boreal forest in north central British Columbia. And to give some context for your listeners, that's about 600 miles north of Seattle and about 500 miles inland from the West Coast. So growing up there influenced me and my connection to sustainability in two, really important ways that have, stuck with me throughout my life. The first is I spent a lot of time on the land in all kinds of activities and in all four seasons of the year. For me, my favorite season is the winter, and there's, nothing more spectacular than being in that pure white landscape, blue sky. It's strikingly quiet. And then when it hits about minus 25, the ice crystals fill the air and it's like diamonds everywhere. It's beautiful. So I fell in love with the vast beauty of nature. And this instilled in me this really strong ethic of care and connection to the land, as we would call it, or to nature. Right?
Nature to the land. Wow, those are some cold winters, but that's how you grew up, and you know it better than any of us. So, if you had that influence of just sustainability, even just growing up, how did you really start putting that into practice? Even just going way back, even before maybe schooling and before your career. So, how'd you put that into practice?
Well, there's a second piece I wanted to touch on that is really important influence, and that is that this North Central region was and still is this resource-based economy, primarily forestry and mining. And so spending a lot of time on the land, I also saw the really significant impact that resource extractive industries have on the natural environment. So then this is, later in my career, I have a really strong sense of the life cycle impacts, and that sometimes really vast reshaping the landscape comes with the materials that we build our cities with, right? Concrete, wood, copper, aluminum, etc. And so, for me then, it's how do we connect design with that ethic of care of the land, thinking about not just the land that we're building on, but that much broader environment that we depend on. So
I'm sure that had a big influence on you. You're right, seeing that resource extraction, that mining, that timbering, it was all around you, yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, I did the kind of go travel. I, fell in love with architecture. I went to architecture school. I went to University of Oregon, which is a great design school, and a school with a really long and strong history of focus in sustainability. So that just continued to expand my understanding of sustainability and how to connect that into an architectural profession. I worked for a little bit in Boston, and then I eventually ended up in Vancouver, British Columbia, which is part of that Cascadia region and a really fertile ground for sustainability.
I was going to ask, just Joanne, being in Cascadia at first, and that part of just where sustainability has big roots and green buildings has roots. Can you tell us about a few of those early projects?
Yeah, in the early 1990s, and I'm really dating myself here, but I had the great privilege to be the project architect for the CK Choi building at the University of British Columbia. And UBC is really well known for their leadership and sustainability, but this was like the first green building that they were undertaking, and we were challenged to set this new precedent for sustainable design and construction. And putting that into a context, that this project kind of precedes the release of LEED. There was no framework on what did it mean to do, a sustainable building. The AIA was just developing their environmental resource guide, and the sections just weren't coming out fast enough for what we needed to them. But anyway, so the Choi building was a really seminal project because at a time when a lot of projects were thinking about energy efficiency, and that was green, this project gave us an opportunity to really explore a more holistic approach to sustainability. We use bioclimatic design and daylighting, passive ventilation, things that we think of in common today. We use circular materials strategy with salvaging timbers for the post and beam structural system, reuse bricks from the region. We even had a on-site wastewater management system. Right? So these were really progressive things at that time. And so this project really broke, I'm going to say, new ground and I think, open doors for projects to follow. But another really powerful aspect of this project was in the team itself. And I really wanted to share this story with the listeners because I think it may resonate maybe with some of them. So up to that point in my career, I was generally consistently the only female on project teams. It was male client groups, male engineers, male construction managers and contractors. So our team for the Choi was comprised of a female client lead, Frida Picani from University of British Columbia, and the full primary design team, with the exception to the electrical engineer, was comprised of women. So this was so cool, an interdisciplinary team, largely of women. And we engaged in what we called a co-design process. It was a precursor to IDP. We had a lot of fun together, and I would say, I've never had a project quite like that because even today, when I'm on project teams, it's still predominantly men.
I can picture that group now. If the LEED reference guides were maybe 7-8 years down the road, you're probably just brainstorming, okay, what can we do to really make this a sustainable building? That's really cool.
Yeah. So this kind of project, it just accelerated my career because I had to do such a deep dive into that. And from there, I got involved in lots of different volunteer opportunities, and that kind of volunteerism just is kind of a theme that has been consistent throughout my career. There's probably one other kind of pivot or shift in my career that I'd like to share because I had kind of had this first kind of long haul as an architect focusing on sustainability. But then kind of mid-career, I did this next pivot and I stepped out of private practice to join University of Calgary as their first director of sustainability. And of course, that was a much bigger field, if you will, to play in. I mean, community of 40,000 people, 150 buildings, and much bigger scope than just looking at the buildings. So anyway, 5 years later, I became the CSO. I lead a team now of about 20 really talented sustainability professionals. And I get to work every day with amazing people doing really amazing projects. And it's been such an amazing kind of arc of my career. And I guess my message is it's such a great space to work in. And especially, when you can tie it back and always be working in a way that's tied to your personal values.
So cool. It almost sounds entrepreneurial even within the university system there. So what was the catalyst to make that change, to go to academia? Were you guest lecturing? Did you find yourself just teaching from time to time and you're like, gosh, I love this? Or what was the catalyst?
I don't actually teach. I'm that kind of change enabler that works inside of the organization to help build that capacity to get things done. What pulled me out of private practice into public sector really was, okay, I could continue to do, I can do another, great green building, but this is an opportunity to really look at sustainability in kind of, I'm going to say like an eco-district context, the campus as a learning lab and to, where you could really look at a much more integrated way of thinking about sustainability at a community scale, plus all of the kind of opportunities pertaining to kind of teaching, learning, and research.
Oh, that makes sense. Thanks for clearing that up, Joanne. So yeah, you're right. Almost like the chief sustainability officer. You mentioned all the buildings, all the people, all the impact, and the influence. So really, that is a big reach, bigger than one building at a time. So I can see what attracted you there. So let's talk a little bit about just that career. And if you look back on the highlight reel, what stands out? What are you really proud of?
I think probably two things come to mind. The first would be that I would highlight kind of the University of Calgary's growth in sustainability. University has become one of the top-ranked universities in Canada for sustainability based on a framework called STARS. It's a rating system that it's kind of like what LEED is to building, STARS is to university campuses. And earlier this year, we were ranked 29th globally from about 800 schools for our progress on advancing United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and this is through the Times Higher Ed University Impact Rankings. So what I'm inspired about is that growth and the confidence of the many people that it takes to contribute to those kind of outcomes, to see kind of the extent of collaboration and partnerships that are occurring both on campus and with community. And then kind of special in my heart is also just to see, the students that we work with, many of them we have kind of ongoing connections with, and just to see the great things that they're going on to do, and that just so inspires you to kind of keep working and keep going. The second one would be I would have to point to kind of the overall growth in the Canadian green building movement and kind of my contributions towards this. I was very involved in the Canada Green Building Council right from the early years. I helped establish the Alberta chapter when I moved to Alberta, and actually just finished a 6-year term on the national board. And probably, over the years, I've probably been on, 10, 12 different committees, TAG, product steering, all kinds of things, right? But so just kind of having contributed to that growth and feeling like I'm a part of that movement, that it takes so many people. It's a community that makes this happen. And so I'm I'm very proud of kind of that kind of body of kind of work, you'd call it.
Absolutely. I think sometimes we don't realize, the U.S. Green Building Council and LEED, Canada is the next biggest user of this tool, this program that came out in the year 2000. And you were there really helping grow the organization across the border. So it's amazing. So let's talk about today, and let's talk more about you and your team and the University of Calgary. So what are some exciting things you're working on today?
Yeah, I was thinking about this question, and of course there's this long list, but maybe I'll just highlight kind of a bit of a sampling of the kinds of things that we're working on. Kind of the first would be a couple of initiatives under our climate action plan, our goal to become a carbon neutral campus. The first is our zero carbon buildings initiative. So we have 3 buildings registered under the CAGBC, Canada Green Building Council, under the zero carbon building framework. And the first of those projects finished last year, which was our McKinney Tower. And it's, I find this one super exciting because it's not a new build, it's actually a retrofit of an existing 15-story library tower. So the project just recently received the Zero Carbon Building Excellence Award for 2020 from the CAGBC, and bringing some new technology and new kind of design in. It's got it's a double skin facade with active shading and both active and passive ventilation. And when we finish phase 2 of this project, we'll generate about 600 kilowatts of renewable energy from photovoltaic. So that's the first of 3 that we have on the go.
Can I ask a question about the project? Sure. That's a big renewable array, first of all. But now, do you find that your team needs to stay involved with the project because some of it's pretty advanced technology and maybe the contractor needs training, or here's how you source that? Can you just unpack that for a minute?
Oh, I'd love to unpack that. One of the departments that's in my unit is the Energy Planning and Innovation team. And we work as like a set of internal sustainability consultants and do lead, all the lead facilitation and zero carbon building piece for the project team. So we have our engineering and our project management group, and then external consultants. And so we kind of really instrumental in the facilitation of the process. And for example, getting IDP really embedded in how we do projects. So a really important part of the success of this project, I'm going to say maybe one of the most important pieces, is the integration of the facilities management operator representatives in the project, like right from the beginning. And in fact, we had some representatives from the project team go to Germany to look at some projects that had already been done there. And we took the operators because they needed to say, yeah, this will work. Yeah, we can make that work. And their buy-in. And in fact, as we actually have a 2-year kind of commissioning and handoff phase. And so, yeah, it's under contract, but we have our operators now working hand in hand, with the people that have kind of, I'm going to say, delivered the facility, so that we make sure that not just that we deliver this zero carbon concept, but that actually we can operate it and for it to be in an ongoing.
I applaud you there. I've heard horror stories, Joanne, about net zero buildings that next thing you know, you build a Tesla of a building and it's run just terribly. They don't really know how to run it. So kudos to you for getting the operations team involved early. So fascinating.
Yeah. So maybe very briefly, a couple other items under the climate action plan is that we're working on a study that's looking at the decarbonization of our district energy system, which is currently fueled by natural gas-fired cogeneration, but you can't get to carbon neutral from there. So it's a really big study, and it would be quite transformative in terms of moving it into different types of energy sources. And, we have to go from a high temperature system to a low temperature system. It's very technical, but very exciting. And again, sort of some new ground there. And then we have a ton going on in existing buildings, and just in the last phase of a $35 million program in existing building retrofits, which is going to give us about another 30,000 tons of emission reductions. So, and again, this is all kind of led out of this energy planning and innovation team that I lead. And then maybe I just want to highlight 2 other really quick things to show the diversity in some of the work that we do. One is that we are just putting the finishing touches on a new landscape master plan, which I find a super exciting project because it brings together our Indigenous strategy with our institutional sustainability strategy. So the document is written from the perspective of integrating Indigenous perspectives on how we live on the land and understanding of ourselves as a part of nature with regenerative design, ecosystem health, and resiliency. So that's a project that's led out of our facilities development group, but we're in there as kind of the experts in the area to bring the regenerative design piece.
I'm excited about that project. So that's neat.
Yeah. And then the other one I have to highlight is our campus as a learning platform, which is so important for our students to grow their sustainability leadership competencies. And it's a program that provides experiential learning opportunities on big questions that we have on sustainability on campus. Last year, we had almost 800 students that were participating on this, and they touched on projects spanning almost all of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So that's kind of just this kind of snapshot of some of the diversity of what we work on.
It's a lot, and you're working on all the right things. I've got to ask, a lot about climate and high performance buildings. Now, the landscape. What about healthy buildings? Is that also under your umbrella? Is that something that's now more than ever very important? Is this a healthy classroom? Is this a healthy building? So what are you and your team doing on the healthy buildings?
Yeah, absolutely. And what the term that we use is healthy high performance buildings, right? You can't have high performance come at the cost of health. And so that's built into that. And, in a very holistic perspective, I think if you think about the CogX study out of Harvard, so cognitive function and how that ties to learning outcomes in the classroom, we can talk about productivity, but more critical for us is that learning outcomes and having, our campus community, be providing an environment that helps them to bring their very best to what they do. And of course, COVID-19 is creating some new challenges with that. And, we could, that's a whole another great big topic, right? And of course, there's this sense, so there's, one of the great things about green buildings is you have really good filtration, you have really good, air, the kind of, I'm going to say that the ventilation system as a whole in terms of the movement of air, and then the filtration. And so that has set us up really well. But, there are unknowns right now about COVID. And so, you take that precautionary principle, and we're putting a lot of outdoor air through all of our buildings right now.
And that's safe, and the humidity levels. And, I think sometimes when we hear high performance building, we might think just energy efficient. But I know from even just this conversation, Joanne, a high performance building has great ventilation and it has great this and great that. It's not just energy. So I'm sure a lot of that you're already doing. But you're right, with COVID and the pandemic, antimicrobial high-touch surfaces and green cleaning and more fresh air and, better filtration. So it's all right in front of us. And I know you're doing a lot of that. I love to ask, what's next? What's around the corner? What should we be reading up on now?
Well, that's a big topic. I think you could almost do a whole interview on that, because it's such an interesting time too, because this global pandemic, we've got this uncomfortable paradox of seeing these substantive improvements in environmental health coming at the expense of this crisis in environmental or in human health, right? And then the associated economic crisis. And so this really highlights, how fragmented we've become in our social, environmental, and economic systems. And of course, some of the inequities, some really substantive inequities in kind of social and economic systems and so forth. So we're kind of moving, increasingly into more and more uncertain and complex times. And I'm thinking a lot about leadership competencies that we need, to move forward in a positive way, in a good way, given where we are. So we always need that technical knowledge, as kind of green building practitioners or sustainability leaders, but it needs to go hand in hand with this kind of deep understanding, I think, of how to listen really well, how to have strong engagement and partnership building competencies. We need more collaboration with disciplines that haven't historically, I'm going to say, been part of the design teams, health and social science professionals, ecologists, climate scientists, etc. So this is a big piece. Another thing I've been thinking a lot about is whether our current green building tools are putting us on to the trajectory that we need for the sustainable future that we're striving for, and whether we might be inadvertently creating kind of a false sense of what we're striving for. A few years ago, I saw this great presentation by Dr. Kate Raworth out of the UK. She's an economist, actually, and she's developed a framework called donut economics. I don't know if you've heard this term before. Anyway, it's a tool to look at how we put together social needs and planetary boundaries. So kind of drawing on the work out of the Stockholm Resilience Center and also, kind of the social dimensions of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So then she looked at this model, so if you look at a city like, she looked at Vancouver, BC, or Portland, that we think of, wow, these are models for great green, sustainable cities. And they're doing, actually a pretty good job at kind of those social dimensions. But if we scaled that approach, across many, many cities, we would far outpace the planetary boundaries and Earth's carrying capacity. So, in contrast, she looked at some of the Latin American cities that are actually doing a kind of almost a similar job from the social dimensions, but their kind of ecological footprint, if you will, is so much smaller. So I think this is a really important thing, is that, our current tools, LEAD and sites and so forth, have done a really good job of kind of setting us kind of a stepping stone towards, I think, something that we ultimately need to evolve to in terms of developing tools that take us farther in terms of those kind of really kind of healthy, just, sustainable kind of one planet living. So, yeah, so, I could kind of talk a little bit more about some of the tools that might help us there, but that's kind of what's on my mind right now.
Oh, it's exciting. And you're right. You even listed off some job titles that probably weren't around a year ago, right? There's this need for, the climate risk side of it and just those that are really thinking ahead about that alone. But you've said it a few times in the UN SDGs, it seems like that has been your guidebook. It's like, look, that's where we need to line up with. And I really applaud that. I think for those listening that are familiar with LEAD, it's a wonderful rating system. It's a great set of tools, but kind of think if there were a LEAD book for the globe, it's definitely take a look at the 17 SDGs, right? That's what we need to line up with. So did you drive that? Is that a Canadian push? I know a lot of Fortune 100 companies here in the United States are aligned with the SDGs. So, how did you choose that, guiding star?
Yeah, I don't know if I would say for University of Calgary, it's not our guiding star. We have our eyes high vision and our academic research plan, and we have some institutional scale strategies like sustainability, Indigenous, international, so forth. And I think what these guideposts do for us is that they allow us to have significant impact on the SDGs. The SDGs are, they're global goals. Government has lined up behind them. Private sector has lined up behind them, NGOs. And I'd say increasingly the external frameworks are lining up on them. So if you're looking at how your rankings, awards, and so forth, then those external frameworks are looking at your contributions to the SDGs. Is that I'm going to say many of the funding groups that, there's a lot of external funding that is being put behind driving the SDGs forward. So that also becomes a mechanism to actually help us move sustainability forward, right?
All of your different frameworks, you just are conscious of how you're helping, how you're contributing with the SDGs. I love it. Well, let's talk a little more about you. What would you say is your specialty or gift?
Well, I don't know that I have some kind of inherent kind of unique gift to me, but I would say I probably have kind of 4 strengths that are leadership strengths that have really helped me in my career. The first is that I'm not afraid of big, complex challenges. I come from a family that has, long line of people who have kind of taken on big challenges because they thought it was the right thing to do. So I probably kind of have a little bit of that in my family characteristics. I also have an ability, I think, to find clarity in complexity, where sometimes people say, "Oh, that's such a big problem," and there's so many issues. Is I kind of have an ability to kind of cut through and see that. And I think part of that comes from being an architect and design thinking, and just also having quite a diverse disciplinary knowledge. So I can look outside of the box, if you will, and sort of see potential opportunities. The third is I have what I would term grit. And if you're familiar with Angela Duckworth's book entitled Grit, it's that kind of passion and perseverance kind of put together. And the last is I think, I have quite a strong, what I would characterize as kind of emotional intelligence. So I'm quite kind of attuned to the human dynamic in the room. And this is so important for people who are, working on sustainability and change leadership is, you can have the most brilliant ideas, but they can fall really flat if you don't have that attention to the human dynamic, right?
I 100% agree. Just that EQ, just you got to really, you can't carry that message and that vision unless you really have the good emotional intelligence. I really think that's a great trait that I'm glad you have that. So, you've accomplished a lot. Those are some really cool strengths. I'm really impressed with everything I've learned so far. Let's talk a little bit about some routines and rituals. Do you have any just really good habits you could share?
Yeah, all lead really busy lives. And I think, how do you find your focus when life's really busy with work and family and all kinds of things? So for me, it's yoga every morning and journaling. I do a 5-minute journal in the morning to set an intention for the day, and I do a 5-minute reflection at the end of the day. I schedule time for strategic thinking and working on big questions, because otherwise all that endless list of seemingly urgent tasks, it just takes over, and next thing you know, you haven't got to the things that are important to you. And the last is just kind of to keep going back to reviewing like my personal mission statement. And that helps me to keep what's most important to me front of mind and to close that gap between how am I showing up versus my aspirations and where am I spending my time versus my aspirations. So for me as a set that, works for me.
That's inspiring. You heard it here. You have to be intentional. And I always like to ask about, you have to make time to think sometimes. That's counterintuitive, but you do. And I'm really happy to hear you do that. That's strategic thinking. I'm a fan of the bucket list. What would be 1 or 2 things on your bucket list? Is there any adventure or travel? Do you want to write a book? What's on the bucket list?
Well, my bucket list is always way too long. But anyway, deep dive into regenerative design. I think, you're hearing this term showing up, but I don't think it's really well understood. And we need to generate resources to help people to understand and engage in regenerative design so we can move regenerative design more into the mainstream. And, I think in the same way that kind of lead mainstream green buildings, I think we're going to need a set of tools to kind of take us to that next level. And I'm interested to really kind of get in and unpack that. I'm also kind of interested, I'm very interested in this concept of 1.5 degree lifestyle. So, because, we're this really consumer-oriented society, particularly in North America. And I think most people have a really low understanding of their impact. And again, a few years ago, I saw this great tool that was developed out of Citra in Finland. And it's kind of like bringing kind of gamification to helping people to kind of say, well, what is your carbon footprint? And then what steps would you take? And so it helps people to get a sense of, well, how big is the impact of recycling versus, traveling to the other side of the world for vacations or commuting to work every day. And so then it helps people to actually kind of then build their pathway to that, to a 1.5 degree lifestyle. So I think this is it's not a green building, but it actually is really important step.
Yeah, and we have to make it personal in our circle of influence and see if it can take off. Amongst my firm, we did a carbon weight loss challenge a few years ago, and we all did our carbon footprint, and we saw who could lose the most carbon impact. And you're right, sometimes I travel on a jet, and obviously that's hurting my score. But it's the purchases, and one might argue right now with a lot of us work from home, while the planet is healing in some places. I know there's a lot of Amazon deliveries that are happening. So you're right. Well, let's show everyone the magnitude of just their lifestyle. So I don't know if that's a link we could share, but I'd love to put some information in the podcast show notes.
I can share a link with you for that. And you can go and look. They've got an actual book, and it's pretty cool. And I don't know if they have some of their games up there, but it was a lot of fun to just kind of tabletop the games. And So.
Well, I think it's great that your bucket list is aligned with sustainability. That just shows that is your true passion. Just a few more questions here, Joanne. Let's talk about books. I don't know if you like to listen to books or pick up a good hard copy, but is there a book or two you'd recommend?
Yeah, I recently read a book called Braving the Wilderness by Dr. Brené Brown. And it's not a book about sustainability or green buildings, but I think it's a really interesting read for people working in sustainability. And I can't really summarize the whole of the book I wouldn't even try to do it in a couple of minutes, but a couple of things maybe that resonated for me, and like from a sustainability perspective. And Dr. Brown talks about this idea that, how as a society we've become increasingly sorted, into groups that are either for or against these really polarized issues. And I mean, if you just look at climate change is one of those, right? Great example. So, but when you're, working in, sustainability, the challenges we face is that you've got to find that way to come into the space between the polar ends, because we are only going to find the solutions to move forward by kind of finding that common ground. And so Dr. Brown kind of, shares, drawing on her research, her thoughts on and how we can work more effectively between those polar ends. So.
Oh, cool. Yeah, she's very popular. I haven't read that book, but I'll put a link in the podcast show notes.
Another piece of that I think is also really important for sustainability leaders is this idea of, from the name of the book itself, Braving the Wilderness. So, when we're working in sustainability, we often, need to find our voice to kind of really talk about, a climate emergency or other significant, social or environmental issues. And this can be kind of this vulnerable and, uncertain space sometimes. And so she kind of gives, she calls that braving the wilderness, kind of stepping out. And she kind of gives some really inspiring ways about thinking about that, how you step into that space and kind of how you can thrive in the wilderness, right? So I think that's cool. A book I'm reading right now that I'm kind of only probably about a third through right now, but I'd like to highlight it. It's called White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo. Yeah, and I think this is a great book for anyone, but particularly for people who are in leadership roles that are leading groups of people or that are working with big teams on projects. So for me, this is kind of generating kind of a much deeper reflection on some of the kind of pervasive, I'm going to say, cultural forces that shape racism, and sort of giving me a new language for talking about and thinking about, racism in the context of everyday life.
No, I've read that one, and you're right. Just perspective on privilege, and not even just white and black, but so many other angles that you might not have thought about. So no, thank you for sharing that. And I'll be sure to put that in the show notes too. Well, as we come to a close, 2 questions. Is there anything you wish you'd done earlier in your career?
I'd say, I think as a young female, trying to kind of find my way there. And I kind of I thought I had to do a lot of things on my own, and I didn't want to show that maybe I needed help, because I always felt like I was, I always felt I had to prove myself more than, I'm going to say, some of my peers. What I would say as a message is, you don't have to do this alone, and, really reach out, find mentors, find sponsors. There's lots of people that are willing to help you and can help, you to kind of get over some of those, maybe those hurdles or those those questions you have. So that would be one of them. I'd say, get involved in volunteer work outside of the project work you're doing. Go find at least 2 committees, right? Reach out, get involved. You're going to meet really great people. You're going to learn from people. And, there's people I work with today through volunteer work that I've known for like 25 years. And so it's not just about the work you do, it's about the community that you're a part of. And it's much bigger than the project, right?
Fantastic advice there. Yeah, and make friendships out of it too, lifelong friendships. All right, well, as we do come to a close, let's say there's someone listening right now, Joanne, that is listening to this podcast. They're getting some encouragement, but, we're in the pandemic and maybe their industry's been impacted, but green buildings, they hear, is actually going strong. What words of encouragement would you give to them if maybe they're thinking of just now jumping into the green building movement?
I'd say just jump in and do it. We need your leadership. We need your brilliant ideas. We need, your contributions. There's tons of work to be done. And do it. Just do it.
You go for it and don't do it alone. Be intentional. This has been Joanne Perdue at the University of Calgary. I'm just blown away. I really enjoyed our chat today, and keep up the great work. Thank you, Joanne.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. It's been an honor to have a conversation with you today.
I just want to say thank you to our loyal listeners. We actually are celebrating over 1 year here on the Green Building Matters podcast. Me and the entire team were stoked and just so glad you continue to listen every Wednesday morning to a new interview with a green building professional here in this industry, or just some pro tips that we want to make sure that you are getting straight from us, straight to you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Green Building Matters podcast. At gbes.com, our mission is to advance the green building movement through best-in-class education and encouragement. Remember, you can go to gbes.com/podcast for any notes and links that we mentioned in today's episode. And you can actually see the other episodes that have already been recorded with our amazing guests. Please tell your friends about this podcast. Tell your colleagues. And if you really enjoyed it, leave a positive review on iTunes. Thank you so much, and we'll see you on next week's episode.